when we're talking about all the evils in the world and all the things that are wrong, we can also start with what we have the most impact over and where we have the most control. If everyone picked an issue and dedicated themselves and their resources to solving it, we'd start ticking a lot of these boxes and we'd start making a lot of progress. We don't have to solve every problem. And the fact that we won't solve every problem does not exempt us from trying to solve some problems.
Ryan Holiday's back in the house as the officially now the most returned guest in show history. Welcome back to the show, bud.
Thanks for having me.
Is it true that this was also the first interview you ever gave for a book back on Trust Me, I'm Lying? There's a rumor going around.
No, that's not a rumor. Yours was the first podcast I ever did. And certainly the first. I mean, I feel like you were so early on the idea of doing something in person on a set, video being a big component. Like, I feel like you were early on that, and then everything went to audio and then came back to podcast. So you were so early. You've seen the full cycle.
I'm bloodied. I'm battered as a result of it. But it's great to have you on the show. The reason you are you have the most appearances here is not, although I do admire you very much, it's because you're crazy prolific. You've got a new book, Right Thing, Right Now. It's another one in the Stoic Virtue series. I do want to talk about that today. But before we dive into that book, tell me about, why the series. You've obviously popularized Stoicism. You've popularized philosophy. Why, is the rest of your work going to be in series because there's a lot to cover, or why have you grounded your work in this concept?
Well, I did this sort of accidental series. The first book I wrote on Stoicism was called The Obstacle Is the Way, which was basically Stoicism applied to a very specific thing. How do we deal with adversity and difficulty in life? Then I wrote one on ego. Then I wrote one on like sort of peace and tranquility and stillness. So I kind of did this accidental series of 3 books that were about Stoic philosophy, but by no means an attempt to explain what Stoic philosophy was. They were applying Stoic philosophy to some specific, and I guess you could say common problems. So what I'm doing on this series is a deep dive into what the main tenets of what Stoic philosophy is. So the cardinal virtues of Stoicism, the sort of 4 main points of it are these ideas: courage, discipline, justice, and wisdom. So that became, I don't know what you call, I know 3 books is a trilogy. I don't know what 4 is called, but that's what it is. It's a 4-book series.
Quadrilogy? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't want to embarrass myself by getting it wrong.
By trying.
So, yeah, exactly. I've never heard. It's not a word I've ever heard. That's what I'm doing. I just did this sort of deep dive into these 4 sort of very distinct but overlapping ideas. And I sold it in 2019. So this is my 5th year on the project. And I'm about halfway through the next one. So I'm just beginning to get to the point where I can contemplate life not working on this series.
Oh, that's been a very, very, it's seemingly from the outside, a very fruitful endeavor. Not just because of, you've developed such an audience for your work, but there's a timing component that seems like it's like omniscient. It's freakish, man. It's the justice, the book on justice was so well timed. This idea of doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like we are on the cusp, or maybe we've already gone over the edge into a lack of moral clarity. Like what does it mean to do the right thing? And you sold this book in 2019 and it's 2024. Is that a sign that these are in fact cardinal, enduring topics, and you're just lucky, or does history repeat itself?
I think this is the idea that these are sort of very timeless universal values to that every society, every individual, and every era wrestles with in its own way.
Mm.
I wrote Courage is Calling in the middle of a pandemic. I did this discipline book coming out of the pandemic, and then now this one as we go into. It's funny. People have been calling it an election year. 2024 is not just an election year. Something like 60% of the world is picking its elected leaders in these 12 calendar months, which is insane.
Yeah.
And across the world, there is this tension between sort of democracy and autocracy. There are these crises, sort of
Yeah.
geopolitically, but then also morally, and then all these problems that we've ignored for a very long time. Whether we're talking about social justice, whether we're talking about income inequality, whether we're talking about climate change, there's all these sort of things that previous generations maybe didn't want to deal with or couldn't go all the way on, and every generation has to wrestle with those ideas in their own way. I As far as timing goes, the only thing I thought about when I did this series, I thought courage is obviously first, because it's the sort of, it tends to be what the Stoics rendered as the first one, and then also I think it's the virtue from which everything else descends. And I knew wisdom was the last one because it was sort of the culmination. And then discipline felt like a nice palate cleanser after courage. So justice being the third book was somewhat happenstance. And it's funny, for people who've read Discipline is Destiny, at the end I talked about sort of hitting a wall with that book, and that I almost needed to ask for more time. I'd signed up to do this, a book a year, for 4 years, and I thought I could do it, and then discipline came around, and I wasn't sure I could do it, and I ended up doing it, but then I decided to ask for more time on the justice one, not so much because I needed it to do the work, but because I wanted it to sort of strike a better, more equitable work-life balance in my own life,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is important. When people hear the word justice, they maybe immediately think of what we were just talking about, like they think of social justice, or they think
Yep.
of politics, or they think of the legal system. And this is all a very important part of it, but primarily, or at least uh, initially, justice is also in sort of how you orient your own life, how you treat the people in your own life, the decisions you make about, you know, how you do and you don't do things is just as much a matter of justice as it is discipline and wisdom. And so I've just been trying. I took more time. This one ended up taking 2 years instead of 1 year, as I wrestled with some of those ideas. So the timing of it is both very intentional and then completely accidental.
It seems like you can see the future. But I think your point is the right one, that these are, the reason is because they're enduring, right? There's always an underpinning of these. And this is what the Stoics knew,
Yes.
about these pillars.
Well, I found that with Daily Stoic, people would be like, "How did you pick today's entry?" And it's like, "Well, I picked it 8 years ago at random. That's how." There's kind of a horoscopy element to books where um, people see in them what they specifically needed to see. Like, you may, when you do a book, you're sitting down and you're obviously trying to think as generally as possible. You're trying to make it as applicable as possible. But there's this magic that happens in art, which is that the audience brings to it something and sees in, it's not that they're seeing what isn't there, but they're seeing what most pertains to them in that moment, what they need most in that moment. And so this is often credited back to the author or the artist or the filmmaker or whatever. And 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 the viewer is actually the one who is doing the work there. They are seeing they, their unique experiences and their unique point of view, and what they're going through in that moment is what allows them to see something very specific that was by definition very general.
Well, it has it comes off, as you said, as some sort of magic, and that I think in itself makes it a really a good topic to write on, because you have projected your genius out into the future. Uh, yeah, I think if we, I studied philosophy in undergraduate and graduate school. And so your work has always been very dear to me. And there's something remarkable that you've done with on the accessibility component, because if you do know anything about philosophy and you're listening right now and you've read Immanuel Kant or Derrida or any, I mean, it's a total nightmare. And yet what you've been able to do is harness the power of real solid thinking and make it, not just palatable, but you framed it in a way that is very prescient and, as we said, just for the past 5 minutes here, very timely. Uh, to what do you credit that? Was the Stoic universe something that you always thought was powerful, and therefore you sought to shine a light on it? Is this an accident because it has been impactful for you? Like, how did we get here?
I mean, I do think very deliberately and intentionally about making the things accessible and practical. I'll give you an example. The way the Stoics render the four virtues, they typically say courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. So temperance to me was just a complete non-starter as a word, right? Like almost nobody knows what it means, and the people who do know what it means remember that it is associated with the temperance movement in the United States, which banned the drinking of alcohol in the early 1900s. And so my decision to talk about temperance through the lens of discipline was a very intentional decision to make the idea palatable and accessible to people who maybe don't wake up and think what I need is some temperance in my life, even though that's what discipline is all about, right? Sometimes discipline is doing more, but oftentimes discipline is doing less. So I thought a lot about this on this book also, right? When people think justice, they think a judge in robes, or they think these abstract moral questions about right and wrong. They're not thinking so much about sort of personal value ethics, which is really what they meant. All right.
Yeah.
The Stoics were involved in politics, but they don't have a lot to tell us about policy, right? So if you think when the Stoics, when we get political with the Stoics, we're not saying, oh, yeah, we're talking about gun reform or tax law. Like the Stoics just have a lot to tell us about being engaged in the process, right?
Yeah.
Depending on one's own reading of the evidence and the issue. And I think where philosophers have trouble with this, and what I try to do in my work, like, you mentioned Kant. When you read Kant, you get this, there's almost this way that the philosophical discussions about justice become so abstract, but also so theoretical that
Yeah.
they almost make you doubt whether there is such a thing as right or wrong.
Yeah.
Like Kant famously said, you should never act in a way that shouldn't be made universal law, right? And so he has this famous problem about, like, the police are knocking at your door to try to get someone you are hiding who's being persecuted, right? Like the famous example would be, like, you're hiding Jews in your basement and the Nazis are beating at your door. And Kant would say, well, you can't lie, right? Because lying is wrong. And so I think people read some of these philosophical issues, like the famous, do you know what the trolley problem is?
Say more.
So the trolley problem is this famous philosophical exercise, which is, um, there's a train on a track, and if it goes this way, it will kill one person, but if it goes this way, it will kill five people. Um, you have to pull the lever. Which direction do you send it? Right, and it's this philosophical debate of whether one life is worth more than five lives. Should a person, anyways, you get into this discussion, and suddenly you're totally upside down and you don't know what's real or not. And what it really is to me, in a large sense, is a distraction from all the much more tangible ethical questions that we make in the course of a day,
Yeah.
right? Do you supply healthcare to your employees or not, right? Do you pay a living wage or not? Do you vote in an election or not, right? Do you Do you buy things made in a sweatshop or not? Do you eat meat or not? There's all these actual questions that we can ask that we have some domain of control over and immediate influence in. And instead, it feels like philosophers want to debate whether we live in a computer simulation or not, and so when what I try to do in this book and what I think the Stoics tried to do was not get caught up in these endless debates about things, but to try to focus on where the rubber actually meets the road with these things.
Yeah.
And that's much more interesting to me.
Well, I think that's the difference, right? Because people with my degree in philosophy, for example, and I'll use my wife's rendering of my degree in philosophy as an example. When we first met, this is a while ago, we'll say, and she's like, "Oh, degree in philosophy. So this is an athlete who took basically the lowest road possible
Yeah.
to a degree." And yet, when we talked through that, and subsequently when people would ask like, how's your philosophy degree treating you? I can legitimately say I use it every day because it is a process oriented
Yes.
discipline about learning how to think about things. And so to me, this is why I've still considered myself a sort of closet philosophy. I've been attracted to your work, but most importantly, why I think your work is so relevant, because it's about how to think, not what to think. And to that end, the timing thing comes back to our conversation here, because now more than ever is a time for us to have good values, to have good character. And the North Star on that seems as, I don't know, murky to most people as it ever has. So, how do you, in a world where, how do you identify the things that you should do from the things that you should not? Because there's this sort of moral ambiguity out
Hmm.
there, and we can come up with edge cases like the kill one person or five people. Well, what if all five people are 84 years and older, and the one person is 18? Like,
Yes.
we can over philosophize these things, and yet you somehow have struck a balance of helping us understand moral clarity, understand good deeds. How do you
Well,
do
I
that?
I think just starting from the idea that the decisions that you make matter and that this isn't all a giant game is maybe a point that is not as commonly accepted as we would like it to be. I think about this with you and I both have podcasts. We know lots of people that have podcasts. I have been shocked and disappointed with the number of people that I know that seem to be willing to have utterly reprehensible guests on
Oh,
because
don't
they
get me
think
started, dude.
it'll do numbers, right? And then when they have those guests on, um, do this sort of both sides nonsense when there are some things to which there is no other side, and then not even to do it in sort of a journalistic way where you ask that person hard questions, but to ask this person who's actively spreading misinformation, or this person who is responsible for or done utterly repugnant things, to just be like, well, let's not talk about any of that. Tell me what you think about this. What kind of self-improvement advice do you have, or whatever, right? And so there is this kind of world where it feels like we all know there are morally vexing, sort of difficult decisions out there, but those are for the other people to make. Me, I should just ask, is this good for my brand or not? Will this make money or not? Um uh it why shouldn't I, right? Like, and so this idea of deciding, there's this line from Confucius where he says, every person should act as if the weight of the world is literally on their shoulders. That every person should act as if their decisions have moral consequence, right? And I think we live in a time where people, I mean, first off, 50% of people just don't vote. Like, the most basic sort of decision, a bit of impact you can have on the course of a government, and especially in a country like America where that government then impacts the scope of world events, people are like, why bother, right? And so that is when you ask people like, hey, why don't you vote? And they go, well, my vote doesn't matter, right? Like, statistically, it doesn't have consequence. Um, And this is why the idea of thinking about it as if it does have consequence matters, because
Yeah.
if you think it doesn't have consequence, you don't do it. If you think it does have consequence, you do it. And I point this out all the time. Like 2 cycles ago, the city council election in the town that I live in, where my bookstore is, was decided by 2 fucking votes. 2 votes. And so that there were 2 people who said my vote doesn't matter. And in fact, their votes would have mattered. And as a result, all sorts of decisions that objectively impact the quality of their streets, the quality of care for the mentally ill homeless people that live in the town, the quality of care for children who are being in abusive or dangerous situations, the level or not level of policing you get. You go on down the line. These decisions are impacted by the people that you elect or do not elect to make those decisions. And so I think at a most basic level, when we're talking about justice, there's like just kind of an earnestness that goes into deciding that, hey, the decisions that I make matter. Look, you and I are not the producers of the Today Show. We're not even Joe Rogan, but the decision to who we decide to platform or not platform has some impact for some amount of people. And the decision to take that decision seriously, these are the kinds of things that fall under this bucket of justice, not whether,
Yeah.
hey, is it wrong or right to murder someone, or can you or can you not do X, Y, or Z.
This concept of responsibility is when you tackle early in the book, and I think
Yeah.
that's basically what we're talking about, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
we have a responsibility. Um, have you can you articulate sort of the flow of what you think the responsibility flow is? Is it to ourselves, to our family, to our country, to our because this is
Yeah.
where I see a lot of people get trapped. Because if
Yes.
the responsibility is to themselves, and then it allows them to sort of eschew doing a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
Versus, how ought we think about that? How ought we prioritize that?
Yeah, we see this in business, right? You go, my responsibility is to my shareholders, right? And I think this is why, and it's not by no means a perfect company, and I probably disagree with him on a lot of things. But John Mackey, the founder of Whole Foods, I think did some really important work, and I've interviewed him before. But he's done some really important work in expanding the definition of what a stakeholder is or a shareholder in a business is, right? And so he decided, pretty early on that the people whose well-being he cared about wasn't just the employees and the investors and the customers of Whole Foods, because if in doing what's right for them, he's also, I don't know, sticking it to some family farm, uh, you know, uh, that's not good for the long term interests of the brand or the business either. If he is tacitly creating incentives that encourage that farm or that supplier to abuse the environment or to abuse the animal, then there's a long-term consequence to that, both directly to the business and into the world that business operates. And I
Yeah.
and his point was that you can still do this within the scope of a capitalistic society and a business that is designed to be successful and make money, right? We're not talking this sort of top down government controlled communist thing where we're trying to help everyone and we end up helping no one. But the decision to go, hey, am I going to manufacture this item in a sweatshop and get 5% more profits that way? Or am I going to manufacture it ethically and sustainably here in the United States and then decide, I don't know, to charge 5% more or to just get more efficient in my branding or my packaging and or just not make 5% more money because this isn't that, like making these decisions has a huge impact, right? And so, I think what's really interesting, and I would encourage everyone to to make stuff in the real world. Like I had this experience with Daily Stoic where, if I'm just an author, my job is to fill out a little thing in a Word document and send it to my publisher and then cash the checks. Or not even the checks, right? Just receive the wire transfers as they come in the other side. But when I decided to self-publish one of my books, when I decided to make some, like I have some here, like Daily Stoic makes these physical products, these sort of philosophical embodiments of the ideas we talk about. Now, all of a sudden, not at a global scale like a Walmart or a H&M or something, I'm having to decide, do I use this facility or that facility? Do I wrap everything in plastic, which might decrease the amount of items lost due to weather domains, but also flood the world with needless plastic, or I'm having to make ethical decisions on a
Yeah.
day-to-day basis that are, again, not global in scale, but also suddenly not theoretical anymore, right? And so it's really easy to have opinions about, oh, hey, we should raise the minimum wage to $20, right? And on paper that sounds great. But your opinion, if you've never hired someone or run a business, that your opinion is not as based in reality as it perhaps needs to be. Now, I guess what I'm saying is it's easy to go, other people should be doing all of these things. The world should be this way. Um, it's more practical and I think has more impact to say, here's who I am and here's how I am going to do those things.
That takes me straight to a section that I read last night in bed about seeing how the other half lives
Mm-hmm.
in this book. And I'm wondering if you could, it's in line with what we're speaking about, but you've got some very specific, a little bit more prescriptive way of thinking about it in the book.
Well, one of the things that struck me, I was reading about Steve Jobs, and we all know Apple products are amazing. We have them; they've changed our lives. I'm talking to you on an Apple laptop. I'm using an Apple device. I got an Apple Watch on. They make great stuff. It utterly revolutionized the underlying technology of our lives. I was stunned to hear that he never actually visited their factories in China. And he didn't, I suspect he didn't visit them for the same reason that you and I don't like to think about them,
Right.
right?
It's
Um,
uncomfortable.
it's
Yeah.
it's uncomfortable, and to see it would almost certainly obligate one to do something differently. There's this famous story about Theodore Roosevelt. Well, he was a local politician in New York. He's serving in Albany, and they're talking about this bill that's going to regulate the manufacturing of cigars, which at that time were done in these sort of little facilities or factories in the slums of New York City, which is now basically the Lower East Side, these tenement buildings. And you know, Theodore Roosevelt comes from a family of businessmen. He's a Republican at that time. The party labels are different, but the Republican policy at that time was sort of a laissez-faire economic view, which is you let markets decide what's right and wrong. And so his initial view is, well, what does my party think of this issue? What do the economists say about this issue? Let's just do that. And which means we shouldn't regulate, we shouldn't get in between the people who know how to make these things and the people who willingly work for them. And the social reformer Jacob Riis meets Roosevelt and he says, hey, look, do me a favor, before you vote on this issue, can you come look at one of these factories? Like, this is 20 blocks from where you grew up, right? Can you come with me and check this out? And Roosevelt agrees. He's a curious guy, so he goes. And he would say that what he saw scarred him and stayed with him for the rest of his life. It was a horrendous sight and a abuse against every standard and sort of decency that minimum standard that you could imagine. There were children living in these factories. It was just a horrendous sight. And so it changes him in this moment, and he's not able to unsee what he saw. It doesn't turn him into a communist overnight. He's still a supporter of business. He just realizes, oh, it's not as simple as I thought it would be and not as clean as I would like it to be. And there's clearly a middle ground here to which we can minimize harm and still maximize the other efficiencies of the market, and all of that. And so the idea of just not turning away and not denying what you know is probably there or what people are trying to get you to see. And in fact, I would urge you, the things that you are most reluctant to see are probably the things that you need to see the most. Uh, t- Steve Jobs was a notorious stickler for every detail on every part of his projects. It was not an accident that he did not walk the floor of those factories. It was because he knew that
You couldn't unsee that, right? You can't unsee it.
yeah, he knew he would have to make significant changes. It would challenge him in a way that was probably incredibly expensive and difficult and distracting. And, I, I'm not saying he's a monster, but it does impact the legacy of that person.
So if we extend that to the idea of seeing how the other folks live, how do we not become paralyzed? Because right now there's someone who's
Yeah,
listening to this who wants to do the right thing, right? And
sure.
and simultaneously we all realize that if we all spent all of our time only doing the right thing,
Yes,
we would, it is a if you're looking for a
sure.
vehicle for paralysis, that's it. And our mutual friend Adrian Grenier, I was on the board for his nonprofit for a long time, and it was we were the first movers around the plastic straw as a
Yeah,
signal for
sure.
just plastic in the ocean. If we can stop, there's like 20 million of these things a day that go into the ocean or something. It
Yeah,
was horrific. And so getting, Alaska Airlines here in Seattle and a lot of the stadiums to agree to stop using it, it was a domino effect and it was
sure.
very effective. And Adrian would then get called out publicly, someone would see him like get in a car, like, oh, you're using gas. And,
Sure.
it's just like, so how does someone who wants to do right, because I don't think anyone who's listening right there is like overtly saying, I can't wait to know the
Sure.
right thing and do the opposite. But how does one operate and not, be paralyzed because they want to do the right thing, but they can't spend all of their time seeking only the right thing and identifying right from wrong all day, every day?
Yeah, you have to pick your battles and you have
Mhm.
to be efficient and effective about it. I'm fascinated by Jimmy Carter. Well, I think one of the most underrated presidents, and then as they say, certainly our greatest ex-president,
Yeah.
right? But he was considered this idealist as a president. You would talk about he said American foreign policy should be based on human rights. He pardoned all the draft dodgers from Vietnam. He gave the Panama Canal back. He made these sort of big decisions. And people would say, oh, you're not pragmatic enough, right? You're too idealistic. And you're like, this is why he's not a good president. The irony was, actually, the fundamental flaw of Carter's presidency is much more basic than that. Carter thought that because his predecessors had been sort of too hierarchical and dictatorial, he would not have a chief of staff, right? So he was the first president in several administrations to not, modern president to not have a chief of staff. And actually, so the problem for Jimmy Carter is not that he's too idealistic. A big problem for Jimmy Carter was that he was too unorganized and he couldn't tackle specific things in the right order, right? And so I think what you're pointing out is very real, and it's very common, I think, or more common with people who are decent and open-hearted, is that you see everything that's happening and you want to help everyone all at once, right? And the other side of that coin is the person who sees everything that's wrong in the world and they get cynical and they say, "Oh, you can't make a difference." Do you know the story of the starfish? That's like one of my favorite stories. There's this little kid and he walks out to a beach and there's all these starfish washed up on the beach, and it's thousands and thousands of them from this storm. This act of nature has endangered all these helpless creatures, and so he starts throwing them back in, right? And this adult who knows better says, what are you doing? He's like, this can't possibly make a difference, right? This doesn't what you're doing doesn't matter. And the boy says, it matters to this starfish, which he then throws back in the ocean, right? And so when we're talking about all the evils in the world and all the things that are wrong, we can also start with what we have the most impact over and where we have the most control. We don't have to solve every problem, and the fact that we won't solve every problem does not exempt us from trying to solve some problems. And so you've got to pick, right? And actually, I think you make a good point about the straw thing, which we're now dealing with a backlash against,
Right.
ironically. But the idea of picking a thing and focusing people's attention on that thing, if everyone did that, if everyone picked an issue and dedicated themselves and their resources to solving it, we'd start ticking a lot of these boxes and we'd start making a lot of progress. The problem is that we often do exactly what you said, which is we get paralyzed, or we get cynical and we think, oh, this is just a drop in the bucket, it doesn't really matter. But it does matter. Every piece of litter that you pick up off the ground is something that doesn't end up in the mouth of some bird or fish thousands of miles away. So we have the ability to make a difference as individuals walking down the sidewalk, and then
Yeah.
we also have the ability collectively as a community to tackle these problems further upstream.
Yeah, there what I appreciate as a resonant point that is sort of supports this is there's a pragmatism in the book, and again, I'll
Yes.
just call it out. Right thing, right now. The subhead: good values, good character, good deeds. There's the bit on pragmatism in there is frankly it's a relief because it's like, okay, just like you're actually not capable of solving all of the problems in the world, so do what you
Yes.
can with what you have, sort of mentality. And I think you just addressed it right there. But one way that this, I believe, gets abstracted is when we talk about geopolitical movements or things like ocean plastic
Yeah.
or things that are big. But I'm wondering if you can bring this book, Doing the Right Thing, right now, bring it home, bring it small to us, bring it to our family. Bring you have two small children, like what are the ways that when people read this book or when you're sharing these ideas, how ought we think about the things? I mean, I know you give the example, you pick up trash, for example, or you pick up nails on the road that you run there in Bastrop, Texas, and every once in a while you'll show a picture of them, and that is a signal for what you're trying to you know articulate here, and it's the act of doing the thing, and so it's galvanizing, it's simple, it's clear. But when we bring these ideas of justice into the house, for example, with our kids and our like,
Yeah.
how do you make this small rather than Eisenhower or
Yeah.
global warming? Take it
Well,
to our kids.
I think about it with my kids every day because we try to go on these walks. We live out in the country. We live on this dirt road. And what's interesting, where I live, my dirt road is not maintained by any government. It's all the neighbors have to do it collectively. We don't even have an HOA. So it's this voluntary thing, which I sometimes talk to my kids when they complain about it. I go, this is why we invented government, just to be clear, because voluntarily getting people to do things on a consistent basis is quite difficult. And that for hundreds and thousands of years, people have had to develop systems to solve these sort of nagging perpetual problems. But when we go on our walks, we make it a game to see like nails and trash that we can pick up, and on one level, we're just saving ourselves, right? Because we drive on the road, and it's a I was they were asking me the other day. I was like, hey, remember? They were like, why are we picking up these nails? And I said, okay, remember a month ago when mom was driving you to your friend's house and she got a flat tire and she had to pull over and then we had to call a tow truck and you were an hour late to the thing you wanted to do? Um, that's because somebody else walked by this. And well, first off, it's because someone is driving around with unsecured things in the back of their truck and not caring about the consequences of their actions. And then, secondly, somebody else could have stopped and seen and done this and didn't. And then, second, we could have made a more concerted effort to do something about this and we didn't. And the result is a negative set of consequences for everyone. So I just try to do stuff like that, and I'm trying to teach them, hey, like when you're at the beach and you see trash, and you go, who the fuck did this? This is so gross. Why? um that's part one, and then part two is going, hey, uh why shouldn't I do something about it? And it's funny because that seems very small, but one of the stories, the central story of the book I tell, which is an amazing story that I wish ever we study the Civil War in US history. I almost rather we didn't study the Civil War and we studied this guy. There's a man named Thomas Clarkson. Thomas Clarkson was a university student at Oxford, and he enters this essay contest, which was primarily about your ability to write in Latin. And so he enters this Latin essay writing contest, and the question was, should human beings be able to buy and sell other human beings? This is in the mid 1700s. So it's the question of slavery, but the question is primarily an opportunity to show off how good you are at writing. So he enters the essay competition and he wins. Not so much on the strength of his argument, which was that you shouldn't be able to own people, but on the beauty of his writing. So as he's leaving, he's accepted this prize. He's leaving Oxford to head into London to start his life. He's riding his horse, and he just starts thinking of the essay that he wrote, and he goes, like, what if I'm right? Like, what if it actually is wrong to own a person? And then he says, and doesn't that mean that somebody should do something about it? And he sort of gets hit with this thought, and it hits him so hard he has to get off his horse and walk. But the thought is, perhaps someone should do something about it, and perhaps that person should be me. And Thomas Clarkson begins what is this, effectively the first abolitionist campaign in human history, the first attempt. Thousands, millions of people had been disgusted by watching somebody else abuse another person, all the way back to the Greeks and Romans. But nobody thought that it was possible for that not to be legally permissible. And Clarkson begins first by this campaign to make the slave trade illegal in the provinces of the British Empire, and then eventually makes slavery itself illegal. And then he starts an organization which continues to fight human trafficking and human rights abuses to this day, hundreds of years later. But again, we think it's so impossible to do something about these problems. But one person looking at a cup going, hey, you could just have a lid with a hole in the top and not need a second plastic thing inserted into it to waste. Or like, look, I'm drinking out of a water bottle that has a plastic straw, sure, but it's reusable and I wash it so it lasts longer. Somebody, each one of these advancements that we have, not just in technology but in sort of human progress, like, a singular person did that, and then a group of people brought it into wider existence. Just as every company you purchase a product from was started by one person, like Jeff Bezos has the idea that books would be easy to ship through the mail, and creates the world's most valuable company as a result. Or Elon Musk realizes that they've made these breakthroughs in lithium batteries, and that you could actually store enough energy to power a car. These are things that singular individuals or small groups of people were able to conceive of, and then they change the trajectory of human history. And it starts much smaller than you think it does.
Yeah, what's that quote? Like, in fact, that's the only way change happens, or something like that. Someone,
Yes, yes.
that's the only way.
It's a single group of hardworking people attacking an entrenched problem. These problems don't solve themselves, and usually it's not enormous organizations that solve them either.
Yeah. So let's zoom out for a second. We've
Yeah.
got in your work essentially a set of guides to help us live a better life. And you've addressed sort of the practical nature of them where possible. And despite selling millions or maybe even tens of millions, I'm not up on your book scan numbers, but uh, we still have so far to go
Of course.
culturally. Is it the same issue that is this the meta issue? Like for those of us that are trying, because right now there's someone who's frustrated and they are committed to, trying to get the plastic out of the ocean. They are committed to trying to make our government, wiser, smarter to a handful of, very particular specific problems. Or it's our school board. And, how I'm wondering if you can just give some advice on how to encourage people who have these fundamental values that you share, and yet there's clearly a lot of work to do. How do we not
Yeah,
lose sight of these things?
yeah, one of the inspiring things that you get when you study history is you see how much progress we've made. And then one of the depressing things you get when you study history is how we've apparently been dealing with the same problems forever and made essentially no progress, right? Like it's this weird sort of paradoxical thing. You are you need to understand human nature is probably not changing, but we can make progress in terms of the ideas that we put forth, the systems we set up, the standards we hold ourselves to, and that's about it, right? And so, when you read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, you see this guy who's the most powerful person in the world trying to remind himself, hey, you got to care about somebody other than yourself, that your decisions have impact on other people, and that you have an obligation to take care of people who are less fortunate, who are less have less resources than you, who are struggling in ways that you are not. And and I think we all need that reminder today in our own lives. I mean, we
Yeah,
live in a society that is considerably more just and equitable and better than the Roman system of conquest and slavery and plunder and abuse, of course, but we're still the same human beings that have that part in us that is so ready to go, why is that my problem? Why should I care? Right?
yeah,
Or that looks around and goes, everybody else is doing it over here. But Steve Jobs probably just said to himself, Nike makes their shit in China, um, uh, this is better than how it was there before, right? And said, this isn't the thing that I have to care about. This isn't my concern. And that impulse is in us always, and it's always there. And i
yeah,
think i think the truly great human beings are the ones who manage to get us to care about something that we didn't care about before. This is what Thomas Clarkson does. This is what the suffragettes did. This is what gay rights activists did. This is like, you imagine in the 80s, you have this thing that is only affecting a very small percentage of society, that at that time people are, for religious reasons, but I think also just for pure laziness reasons, want to make it that community's fault, right? You want to go, this AIDS crisis is a result of moral degeneracy, because if I say it's a result of moral degeneracy, then I don't have to
yeah.
do anything
It's a
about it.
them and not a, yeah,
This is what society does during the crack epidemic, right? We go, this is an inner city problem. This is a cultural problem in a community that I don't belong to, even though the inner cities are a result of inequities endemic in American society that go back to the founding with slavery. But we said, hey, look, the crack epidemic is a problem that affects people who are not like me. Well, the result of that was not just unnecessary suffering and death and crime and problems. Lo and behold, a few years later, as the crack epidemic is waning, what happens? Now there's a legal pharmaceutical version of opioids that is spreading through society, and isn't just an inner city problem, right? It affects everyone, rich and poor, white and black. It affects everyone. And had society cared a little bit more then about that, right? Had society cared, set up better public health programs during the AIDS crisis, we might have dealt with COVID better, right? If we cared a little bit more about the elderly before the pandemic, fewer of them would have died during the pandemic, and then the rest of us wouldn't have had our lives so disrupted, right? So when we think about empathy and the decision to take on a problem that is affecting someone who's not like us, we should remember that we're not just helping them. We are almost invariably helping future versions of ourselves or future generations comprised of people that we do care about.
Yeah.
Um, and that's why if you need an extra motivation, let it be that.
It just that makes me almost it's a requirement to call out the way you've organized the book, right? Into me, we, and all as the three separate sections. And that is, it's a direct reflection of what you're just talking about. We're talking about all of us. The actions
Yes.
are individual, and the people that we can affect are close to us. That's, that makes it those are the people that we can have an impact on. See
Yes.
earlier points that you've made. Um, well, another just again, so timely, prescient, smart topic. You've clearly hit your stride. I love to always have a few uh, comments from you about the creative process, since
Yeah.
the people that listen and watch the show identify very much with the creative process. They're creators, they're entrepreneurs, and one of the things that is obviously very remarkable about your career is uh, how prolific you are. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. We've brought it up before. It's always some of the commentary that is the most insightful. And, having just dissected this latest piece of your work again, highly recommend it. It's a beautiful, beautiful package, by the way, in this book. Right thing, right now, good values, good character, good deeds. But let's talk about the process. Like
Yeah.
you've been, 4 books in 4 years you talked about, and then you fudged a year. I'm not going to call you out on that, but
Well, you know
how
what
do you do?
happened? Well,
Tell me.
I think that was the biggest change in my creative process on this book. And it's funny, it originated from something I talked about in Discipline is Destiny. I was talking about this writer, Joyce Carol Oates, who's one of the most prolific novelists of the 20th century. And she would talk about how she would finish a book and let it sit in a drawer for a year. Like she would just let it sit and she would go work on another project and then come back to it and finish it and publish it or not publish it. And so I really liked that idea. And so I finished the first draft of what I didn't have a title. I was just calling it the Justice Book. I actually finished it in January of 23. And it was set to be published in the fall of 23. That was the track that I was on. And instead, I ended up asking my publisher, I said, look, I need at least another year. So we worked out a summer 24 release, which is when it's coming on now. And so I basically let it sit for like many, many months. So I finished a version of it. And then I said, I'm going to go off and I'm going to have some more family time. I'm going to recuperate and relax a little bit. And then I'm going to come back to it. And so I spent, a good chunk of those 18 months not writing new stuff, but just, I'd pick it up every once in a while and I'd just fiddle with it and I'd make a change here or there. And it was the first time that I really had time on any of my projects where I had more time than I needed. Almost always I'm finishing it in a tight window, but I'm not rushed, but I'm not I don't have the luxury of just not thinking about it for large chunks of time. And so I would be curious to see how different it is from that January 23rd draft. What I do notice about it is that it's much shorter.
Hmm.
So I spent a good chunk of that time not adding, but subtracting and finding things where, hey, you know what? Actually, if I combine these two things, it becomes much stronger. And the book becomes tighter. So I really spent a lot of time on this one, just taking my time, and it's been creatively very, very eye opening for me.
And that's not always possible, right? The reality
Of
is, as a
course.
professional creative, you get paid to create on demand. And yet, do you feel like this is going to be a new pattern for you? And do you have something to learn about your overall process as an artist?
I think I am thinking about it. It's like, what is the point of sort of succeeding in your field, getting some leverage if you're not going to use it, you know? uh I think Cal Newport, he talks about
Yeah,
how you
I'm on the
develop
show.
this sort of leverage. You work for a company. We're not all self-employed creators. You work for a company for 10 years, you do a really good job, they need you. And so how do you use that leverage to carve out time and space for yourself to have a work environment that's more conducive to, you know, your fulfillment as a human being? And I think I was like, who is this book a year, who is this pace that I'm on, who is benefiting from it the most? I'm benefiting from it, of course, but it's also just this multi-billion-dollar corporation that I work for that's really getting the most. So I just decided, hey, like, I'm not hurting for anything. I I don't feel like my idea has an expiration date. I'm gonna actually have to use some discipline here to work slower and to be more intentional about what I'm doing. And that's the choice that's how I'm going to spend some of that capital that I've accumulated. And I don't think I'm gonna add a year to every project, but I do. I'm not gonna be rushed anymore. And when somebody says, "Oh, we need it by this time," I'm gonna say, "Who's?" This might sound a little egotistical, but I'm gonna say, "Who's actually the important variable here? Like why am I rushing?"
Who's
So
the they?
yeah, well, no, I'm just thinking, like, you have your publisher, and they're like, you're like, Chase, we need this by this time, we need this by this time, and then you kill yourself to make this thing from nothing, and then they're like, all right, we're gonna need 45 days to read it, and you're like, 45 days to read it? I almost wrote,
I
like
wrote
you
it in
realize,
45 days.
yeah, you realize, like, you're rushing so other people can have lots of time,
Yeah.
right? And I find this in all aspects of my creative life. You know, you realize, like, who is this revolving around, right? And just setting up your life in your systems so the tail is not wagging the dog.
Do you feel like creative um, freedom and latitude is a blessing or a curse? Like constraints obviously create a lot of uh, they create focus,
Yeah,
and yet what you're talking about is allowing a little bit more time for the work to breathe, for the reflection process on the work, the refinement. Like I'm not looking for a generic statement that's going to apply to all art, but
sure.
mostly to where you are. Is there a difference to where you are in your career as a master author relative to how someone who is just beginning might ought to think about it, or is that still too
Yeah.
generic or general?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is where that virtue of temperance comes in. It's a balance, and I think there's seasons to it. So early in your career, you know, you're trying to get as many reps in as humanly possible, so you can get
Yeah,
good at that thing, and that means being efficient. That means operating with a sense of urgency. That means jumping on every opportunity that there is. And then as you grow and you succeed, the result of that should be less pressure. Not that means you lessen your standards, but less logistical pressure on you, um, because now it's much more a matter of quality than it is quantity,
yeah,
and
yeah.
so I'm thinking about how I'm making decisions, what I'm agreeing to, what I'm not agreeing to be more cognizant of, hey, if I want to do this for a long period of time, if I want to do this sustainably, then I'm gonna have to figure out how to pace myself, and I'm gonna have to figure out healthier deadlines and boundaries, not just what's the fastest I could do this or the most I could do, but I want to think more about the best I could do.
The It's no secret that you also own an independent bookstore, and I'm wondering how you feel like from this to me is going to come down to an attention conversation.
Yeah.
And you are very clear, and you've highlighted in previous episodes here on the show, and I've heard you in other areas or in other interviews and whatnot. And just because I know you personally, you write in the morning, right? You get up, you
Yeah,
go to work, you do your thing. You've got some more time with the kids in the afternoon. Um, you have introduced, what would mostly be considered a spanner in and yet it seemingly has been sort of a beautiful twist of fate on your career, and a lot of the things that you have articulated in the past about efficiency and productivity. And it seems like owning a brick and mortar retail store in a world where so much of these things are going opposite. It is a zag when classically everyone else is zigging, and that is in part what makes it beautiful. But how can the master who articulates so many things about efficiency and optimization and clarity uh, essentially do the opposite? Like, this is the classic, the rules are meant to
sure.
be broken, just know when to break them. And I'm wondering if you can articulate a little bit about your experience
It
there.
it it does come down to the question of what are you optimizing for? Are you trying to become this sort of monk who does nothing but create all day and isn't engaged or involved in the world at all? When you think about virtue, the virtue of justice, it's not just saving humanity. It's also, just having a positive impact in the community that you live or the industry that you operate in. And I think independent bookstores are important. I think they matter. I think I also love them, and so it just was a thing where it was something my wife and I could afford to do, and we could afford to do uh, in a non disruptive way to our actual life, right? So I my office is there, my podcast studio is here. I was going to have to do those things anyway. And so I thought, hey, instead of renting some office space in the middle of nowhere that helps no one but the landlord I pay rent to, why don't I, have a retail component to a space that I was already setting up? So it's not quite as much of a zag as maybe it seems like on the outside. And I know you've been there. It's not,
It's
it's just a
beautiful. It's
little.
so cool.
Thank you.
So
It's
cool.
it's 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 like the headquarters for everything that I'm doing. But I try to make I've gotten a bunch of people that have come and said, "Hey, let's franchise this thing. Let's open a bunch of them." And it's like hard pass, immediately no, because
Do those
because
people
I,
even know you? I mean,
but I think what they didn't understand is how I was measuring success of the project.
yeah.
Like, if the goal was to make a lot of money, then first off, I wouldn't have opened a bookstore to begin with. But second, uh, I would be interested in such a thing. If the goal was to have something that's a positive impact but has uh, minimal disruption to my life and my other work, well, then it's pretty clear it's a one and done thing.
Yeah.
And how many employees we're going to have, how we're going to expand, except all these decisions become clear. So it's not that you have to become this unbalanced, overcommitted thing, like that you don't have room for personal life and friends and other projects. You just have to make some decisions about how you want all these things to integrate into your life.
Where does play come into your world? The concept of play.
I mean, having a bookstore is just a giant sandbox. It's just fun,
Yeah.
It's really cool, and so that was it. The idea is like, I just want to do this thing. I wonder what it would be like, and that's where that came from. So it's been amazing, and my kids are always running around, and it's just this cool. It's a cool other part of my life that my success in the thing that I'm good at is able to subsidize, and I think that's a way to think about it. Like, your reward for being successful at what you do should not be that it sucks the fun out of every other part of your existence. And that happens. You see people who that happens to. They become these slaves to the entity or the machine that they've built. And I'm not sure that that's the right way to do it.
That is as profound as any statement you've made in the last hour, and very, very true. That said, Congrats, man. You're
Thank you.
a bright light in the philosophical world and helping people understand the framework for living a good life. You've done a fantastic job, and I will shout out one more time: right thing, right now. Good values, good character, good deeds. It's not a secret, also, that you do a great job of providing a bunch of special access and special copies, signed copies. We were jesting before we started recording about what it looks like to sign 15,000 tip-ins. Can you give us any context there for people who want like special access to you, to this material, special sort of covers and copies and whatnot? You do a great job there.
Yeah, the biggest thing you can do for an author is pre-order the book or buy stuff directly from them. And so you can pre-order the book, and I got a bunch of awesome bonuses at dailystoic.com/justice, including when I do the edits of the manuscript as I'm working on a book, the physical, the all my drafts, and then the first pass pages and the second pass pages and the audiobook and all that. I keep all those pages. So people who pre-order a couple copies, you can get like an actual page from the book as I was making it. And so just stuff like that you can grab on the pre-order launch page.
Artifacts. Again, that's
Yeah.
dailystoic.com/justice for this book.
/justice. Yes.
Awesome. My good man. Thanks again for being a guest on the show. Officially
You're the best.
reigning champion, most appearances. You are dunking on all of our other friends. They're way behind, way less prolific. Again, the book's Right Thing, Right Now, Good Values, Good Character, Good Deeds. Ryan, thanks for being a guest on the show.
Thanks.
Signing off from, I'm up here in Seattle, and Ryan's down there in Bastrop, beautiful Bastrop, Texas. Is that how you say it, Bastrop?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
There you go, Bastrop, Texas. The Painted Porch Book Shop. Signing off until next time from Ryan and myself. We bid you, until the next one, which is probably, I don't know, a week or 10 days from now. Thanks, everybody. Signing off.